The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Accessing Resources for Reentry Efforts in Tribal Communities. I'm Travis Johnson, your moderator for today's session. I'm a Grants Program Associate here with the American Probation and Parole Association, and we're happy to provide you today's webinar through BJA grant funding. Today, we're joined by the Honorable B.J. Jones, the Executive Director of UND's School of Law of Tribal Judicial Institute. A recorded version of this webinar will also be made available for everyone that wants to go back and watch it again or share it with a coworker or anything like that, just in case you want to go back and take another look. This session will be posted directly on the YouTube page, or you can find the link in the APPA Tribal Repository website. We'd love to hear from you. Feel free to post your questions throughout this session, and we will designate the last 15 to 20 minutes or so to respond to those. For those of you just joining us, welcome. I'd like to introduce today's speaker. The Honorable B.J. Jones has over 25 years experience as a tribal judge for various tribes in the Northern Plains area. He currently serves as Chief Judge of the Sessaton-Wahpeton AO and its treatment court. In addition, Jones teaches criminal law and jurisdiction in Indian country and a seminar on the Indian Child Welfare Act at the University of North Dakota School of Law. Jones has presented at over 200 national and regional conferences since 1995, including the Indian Nations Conference, Department of Justice events, United States Federal Courts conferences, the Federal Bar Association events, and the National American Indian Courts Judges Conferences. Jones also serves on the North Dakota Supreme Court Tribal State Judges Committee. All right, Mr. BJ, it's all yours.
Hey, thank you, Travis. Thanks to the participants also for joining in and listening. A little bit more about myself. I actually graduated from law school in 1984. During law school, I really got a passion for practicing poverty law. So when I graduated from University of Virginia, I actually went to the U.S. Census and discovered that Todd County, South Dakota, home of the Rosebud Sioux Indian Reservation, was the poorest county in the nation. Moved there, became a public defender and a legal services attorney there. Advocated for a lot of people charged with misdemeanor and felony offenses. Did that for about 11 years, became the litigation director. Worked a lot on the Pine Ridge Standing Rock Reservation, and then, as Travis indicated, became a tribal judge and also started teaching at the UND School of Law. And as a tribal judge, I probably locked up 40,000 people, and that's a pretty heavy burden to bear, actually. And thinking about it, probably 95% of those people I locked up, I would probably be willing to bet I would feel free to go to lunch with them, not have any fears. But a lot of times we lock up people not because we're afraid of them, but because we're just upset with them. They don't do what we want. And as a tribal judge, I think one of the things that I've been most disappointed in is we talk a lot about restorative justice in tribal communities, but the key element to restoring what's been taken from a community is reentry of people who have done wrong. I think that really completes the circle of justice that we're trying to strive for in tribal communities. So I became real interested in working with people who come back to the community as not only as a judge, but in other capacities. And I know at Sessaton-Wahpeton now we actually have a program, a joint state tribal parole program, where the state funds a tribal parole officer. And it's actually improved and lowered the recidivism rate because a lot of tribal members feel more comfortable working with a parole officer from the tribe, not necessarily the state. So next slide, Travis. All right, I'm going to talk about accessing resources for a reentry program in tribal communities. But before you start talking about what you need to develop a reentry program, I think it's critical that you identify what are the issues facing tribal members when they come back into your community. Because I know a lot of tribes and a lot of courts off reservation think that the key for successful reentry is A, get a job, and B, stay clean and sober and drug free. And I think that's really a misnomer sometimes. I know in our community at Sisseton and Wapaton, one of the things that alarmed me, and I think really impacted the ability of people to reenter, was about 75% of the people who would come back to the community after being institutionalized, either in prison or in other institutions, would have tribal warrants or child support warrants. So many of these people went right from what would be a happy event, getting out of custody, back right into our jail. So we had to look at that issue as an obstacle to reentry in tribal communities. So we started an amnesty program allowing people to come in and clear their warrants without being arrested. So I'm going to look at some of the issues that face people who come out of institutions, and a lot of these issues also face Native people. I'm also then going to explore how federal and tribal laws may negatively impact the ability of people to reintegrate into a tribal community. Unfortunately, many people who come out of institutions are labeled for life sometimes when they come out because of felony convictions. And that label brings with it a lot of disqualifications, civil disqualifications that impact your ability in that community to work with people who you want to successfully reintegrate. So I'm going to look at some of those things. And then lastly, I'm going to look at some resources that tribes or others who are interested in a successful reintegration of tribal citizens into their community can access. There are actually some federal resources, some chance for state tribal collaboration to help people coming back. And then lastly, there are a lot of tribal human resources that can be utilized to help people who come back into the community. One of the things I've noticed working in tribal communities as a judge and as an attorney, one key ingredient that I see for successful reintegration is utilizing one's culture, one's traditions. The people who are able to discover their culture while incarcerated or re-energize it while incarcerated and after being released have really been able to maintain that role they play in the society and been able to successfully reintegrate. So it can be done. It's not only the need for cash resources, but human resources can be tapped into. Okay, Travis, next slide. Just wanted to touch on what reentry is. Basically, it's defined as returning to the tribal community from a correctional institution or mental health facility. Now, we don't really have a good idea of the numbers of tribal citizens returning to the community. But if you look at the incarceration rate for Native people, which tends to be very high, some states like in the Dakotas and Montana and Alaska, Native people tend to be disproportionately incarcerated, sometimes 10 to 11 times more than the general population. So because of that high incarceration rate, of course, commensurate with that, there's going to be a higher number of people coming back to the community. Also in Indian country, we have what I consider this unique type phenomenon of tribal members who have never really lived in the community, but their lives take a turn for the worse. They get incarcerated and they come back to the community looking for ways to cope with their lives after incarceration. So it's an entry issue. We have a lot of people who, for the first time, move back to the tribal community in search of some cultural attachment, some traditional values that will help them stay out of correctional facilities. So Indian country, we have a lot of people coming home, and we have a lot of people coming home for the first time, and we have a duty, I believe, to reintegrate these folks into the tribal community if we truly want to exercise restorative justice. So that's what reentry is from a tribal perspective. Okay, what next slide, Travis? Okay, like I mentioned, before you can fully determine what resources you need to access to help those people coming back to the community, you need to assess what are the issues facing persons, Native persons who return to tribal communities. And I've looked at a lot of reports. For example, this first statistics comes from a 2017 Office of Minority Health report. Almost half of the individuals who are incarcerated, institutionalized, and who come back to tribal communities have some diagnosed mental health condition. And when they come back to the tribal community, there's oftentimes a lack of continuum of care for these individuals. The primary source of medical care, both mental and physical conditions, is the Indian Health Service. There's been 2 lawsuits over the last 30 years against the Indian Health Service, one out of Montana, one out of South Dakota, which the one out of South Dakota I was fortunate enough to be involved in, where the Indian Health Service was sued for breach of trust because they were not providing adequate mental health care for Native people. And in both of those lawsuits, the federal courts ruled that the Indian Health Service has a duty to not only provide for the physical health of tribal citizens, but the mental health. And this is critical for those persons coming back to the community, because they can get a job or they can stop using drugs or alcohol, but if their underlying issue, their mental health issue, isn't addressed, they oftentimes recidivate and return to prison. And with regard to a lot of tribal members, tribal citizens, the genesis of a lot of the mental health issues, I believe, are related to victimization. For example, in our system where we operate a parole program, we also operate a drug court. And many of the young people I see coming back to the community from prison, and also those who come to our drug court, have victimization issues themselves. In other words, they were victims as children, young adults, of either victimization by individuals, institutional victimization, being in foster care and moved from home to home. And we never really did a good job as a community in helping them deal with the trauma from that victimization. So when they come back, when they become adults and we graduate them into criminality, because we haven't really helped them with their issues. So in order to really reintegrate that person into the community, we have to understand what the community did to that person and help them recover from that. Another problem with a lot of persons coming back is a lack of education. 40% of all inmates who return from federal state prison lack a high school education, lack a GED. Now, many of them receive that in prison, but most of them come back to the community without the necessary education and job skills to get employment. You combine that with some tribal communities where the unemployment rate exceeds 50%, and then also the fact that they're felons, and statistically speaking, a felon is 50% less likely to even get a job interview. That's the triple whammy against a lot of these folks. So that's a huge issue when it comes to tribal communities. People coming back without an appropriate education. And my experience as a judge in many communities is tribes emphasize, sometimes I think too much, drug and alcohol-free lifestyle, when in reality the pipeline to prison is not that, it's a lack of education. And I know many tribal communities who look at that and decide that they can help people coming back. I know upon the Fort Berthold Reservation, for example, in North Dakota, at the Tribal Community College, they help a lot of tribal members who don't really have an education, but they help them develop welding skills. They're certified in welding, and they can obtain jobs in that particular field. So that's a huge issue, I think, lack of education. If that's an issue in your community, you've got to get resources to address it. Unfortunately, about half of those people who return back to the community have an unsuccessful reintegration, and they wind up back in institutions within 3 years. And that number may actually be lower in Indian communities. I've met a lot of young people who come back to the community. Within a month, they've committed more offenses. And sometimes they even say to me, you know, I came back, I didn't have any structure. At least prison gives me structure. I know when I'm going to be where, what I'm going to be doing. And it's our obligation as a community to give them that structure. 10% of those who return are homeless. It's difficult sometimes if you're a felon to get housing in a tribal community because most of the housing is public housing and there are restrictions. And then this last statistic is one that I think we definitely have to address in tribal communities. 62% of those who return have delinquent debts or warrants related to their incarceration. Delinquent child support is a big one I see in many communities, and I'm not in any way saying that people who are incarcerated, that should be an excuse for not paying for their children. But the reality is that they're unable to really to pay, but yet the obligation still remains. So when they get out and they have a warrant for child support, and there's a bond they have to pay, or there's a bond they have to pay for a tribal charge, that's basically putting obstacles in front of them that maybe we can work with them to remove. So those are some of the issues you have to look at. What exactly are the issues facing those in your community who return before you can develop a plan to access resources to help these individuals? You have to determine what their issues are. Next slide, Travis. And then, of course, there's the legal baggage that's associated with being incarcerated. And here are some laws that I'm just laying out that basically interfere with our attempts to reintegrate people into the community. The Native American Housing and Self-Determination Act essentially does not allow certain felony drug offenders or felony violent offenders to live in tribal housing. And if you're in a community where 95% of the housing is run by the Tribal Housing Authority, you've got a severe problem there when you're trying to bring people back into the community. And not only does this law say you can't be a tenant, sometimes it means you can't live with a tenant of a house authority house. So as a tribe, you've got to work around that. You've got to identify ways, maybe some alternative housing, transitional housing that people can live in. Sex Offender Registry Notice Act. That's another provision that many tribes now run their own sex offender registry programs. And of course, many tribal laws prohibit certain sex offenders from living in certain communities. There's a new law called the Native American Children's Safety Act, which basically states that foster children cannot live in homes where there are certain convicted felons. So if grandma would like to have her son, who's coming out of prison for drugs, live with her, but yet she has some grandchildren placed with her by social services or by child protection, she's got to make a choice. And that's a difficult thing for her to do, but that's what federal law says. Children cannot reside in homes of certain felony offenders. And then we have the temporary assistance to needy families, and this food stamp program may also have disqualifications for persons who have been felony drug offenders, for example, that you can't receive these services. And sometimes, especially for young Native women coming out of prison, and I have noticed a trend in a lot of communities. The incarceration rate for young Native women is accelerating more rapidly than any other group. And a lot of this is related to drugs, but this is a group that typically will have children. And when they come back into the community with the obligation to raise their kids, if they can't access these programs, it presents burden for them reintegrating. So that's another issue we have to look at. Okay, Travis, next. So again, when you want to determine what resources you need to allow to contribute to a successful reintegration of tribal citizens back into the community, you basically need to first identify what are the main issues facing these tribal citizens who come back. I mean, many tribes I've seen, the primary objective has been let's keep people clean of drugs and alcohol, and that's certainly a very important objective. But if you have other problems facing these individuals, merely keeping them drug and alcohol free is not going to solve the problems. There's going to be the need to develop other resources, access other cash resources, human resources that can address some of the other issues. I think there's another part of that one, Travis. Yeah. Typically, when people come out of institutions, one of the requirements is they maintain employment. And when people come back to many tribal communities, telling them that the number one objective of a successful reintegration is getting a job is oftentimes a farce, to be honest. A, they already have strikes against them because they're felons, and B, they're coming back into a fairly impoverished community where there are no jobs. However, that hasn't stopped a lot of tribes from developing pretty aggressive programs to hire people coming out of prison. I know in one tribal community I work at, tribe has 3 casinos. And these casinos are pretty active in hiring tribal members, many of whom who come out of prison. Now there's some limitations on what jobs they can hold because of certain requirements for clearance, but many of them can get jobs there. So it's critical, I think, that for tribes who want to develop reintegration or reentry programs, especially when members are coming out of state prison, well, one of the requirements is going to be they obtain employment, that the tribe work with the court, the tribe work with probation, and the employers in the community to ensure they can be employed. That may require working with what's called TARO, Tribal Employment Rights Ordinance. Most tribes have that. And that is a law that requires contractors and others in the community to give Indian preference to tribal members. That the tribe can creatively use TARO to employ tribal members coming back to the community. So the message I want to send is assess what the needs are of those coming back to the community. Don't prejudge what they need. We need to look at that community of people coming back and determine what their problems are before we look at developing or acquiring resources to work on those problems. Okay, Travis, next. When you talk about the community of people who return, it's both a negative and a positive. The negative is many times it's a strain on resources, already limited resources. But there's also a lot of positive to people coming back to the community. And I like this quote from Attorney General Loretta Lynch, that when you improve the programs available for tribal members who return to the community, it's not only good for those individuals, but it's good for the community as a whole. Again, I see a lot of young Native mothers who are sent to prison who come back with young children. And if we bolster that young woman, get her employment, get her an education, help her deal with her victimization issues, we achieve a lot for her, but also a lot for her family and the future generations. I mean, that the benefit reverberates throughout the next few generations. So I think this kind of work is spiritually uplifting. because it's work that affects future generations, especially when you have young people coming back to the community. So I think that in that way you can be inspired by doing this work and understanding, again, this is really closing that circle of restorative justice we talk about in tribal communities. But unfortunately, this has probably been the most neglected part of that tribal restorative justice, and that's reentry into the community. Next slide, Travis. Okay, where do we find resources? Now, before I start talking about financial resources, programs that the federal government offers, I want to first talk about human resources. There are a lot of people in tribal communities who are very willing to accept and allow people to redeem themselves for their prior wrongs. In fact, I think many who have worked in tribal communities have met people, oftentimes people who are mentors in the community, who they themselves have criminal records. I know of many elected leaders who have been convicted of some pretty serious crimes when they were young people, but they were given the chance at redemption. And these people also now are willing to be human resources for those people coming back to the tribal community. And there are a lot of resources in tribal communities now that can be tapped into to help those coming out of institutions. I give some examples here. Many tribes operate a GED program to allow young people coming out of institutions to get a high school equivalency diploma. Some of these are operated through tribal community colleges. I know tribes that operate them through their their temporary assistance to needy families programs. So there are programs that can help respond to that lack of education. Healing the wellness courts. We operate one at Sisseton Wahpeton. We've operated it for about 20 years now. One of the things we do give an option to people coming back to the community if they want structure, because remember, lack of structure is oftentimes cited by individuals who relapse quickly or recidivate quickly as one of the reasons they relapse or they recidivated quickly. They just didn't have that structure. We've used our drug court, we happen to call it a treatment court, for persons who come back, who need that structure. They can enroll in our Healing and Wellness Court. It's a one-year program. It requires lots of things, including UAs. It requires that you get a sponsor. It requires spiritual activities. But it's a one-year program that you could extend to those persons coming back to your community, because many of them are incarcerated because of a substance abuse problem. So if you allow them to work this program when they come back, hopefully it'll lower the recidivism rate and allow them to be functioning community members. The Indian Health Service, again, has a trust responsibility to provide services to tribal members through its contract health program, not only for their physical ailments, but for their mental health needs. Now, I realize in talking to a lot of people, the Indian Health Service is notoriously weak in providing mental health services. But there are court cases that mandate that they do this. And I think we have to hold the federal government responsible, because it is a trust responsibility the government owes to Indian people to help them with any mental health issues they have. We've got many tribes that have the community colleges. And I mentioned one community college that does certification for welding. These colleges can be utilized to help people who come back into the community from institutions. A lot of these colleges offer GED programs. They offer vocational certification, things like that. Tribal probation departments. Many tribes operate those through their court systems. There's no reason why these individuals who come out of institutions, many of whom have pending criminal charges in the tribal system, why tribal probation officers can't be tapped into to provide services, tribal employment rights ordinance, the TARO programs regarding Indian preference employment, they can be looked to. And then also don't forget about traditional groups or societies in your community and spiritual leaders. If you look at many of these people, many of them in their past have had situations where they've violated the law. Many of our best treatment providers in Indian communities are ex-addicts, people who understand what causes Native people to abuse drugs and substances. So there's a lot of spiritual resources, there are a lot of human resources that we can tap into in tribal communities. All right, Travis, next. Don't overlook the possibility that maybe the state or joining counties may have resources to help tribes. As I indicated, we reached out to the state, or the state may have reached out to the tribe to develop a joint parole supervision program. Many states get monies, for example, for juveniles who may be coming back to the community that could be passed through to tribes to provide services for juvenile offenders returning to the community. There's also the chance for collaboration in providing mental health services. Remember, Native people who live in tribal communities are still state citizens. They should be eligible for all those services that the state provides to other citizens of the state. Merely because they may live in a tribal jurisdiction and not be subject to state jurisdiction in certain situations doesn't mean they're not eligible for that whole panoply of services that state citizens are entitled to. So always don't hesitate to reach out to adjoining counties in the state and find out what services are there that can be utilized, tapped into to help those reentering the tribal community. Okay, Travis. Okay. Where can you get financial resources to fund reentry programs in tribal communities? Okay, there's several possibilities. Now, many of these programs are relatively recent in origin because at one time the perception was we should not fund services for criminals. There's a lot of funding for victims, there's a lot of funding for law enforcement, courts, but at one time the perception was criminals shouldn't be funded by the government, by the taxpayer. Now, over the years, I think we've evolved in that line of thinking to realize that it actually saves the taxpayer dollars by helping reintegrate people successfully into the community. I think I saw a statistic once that for every $5 we utilize to lock people up, if we only put $1 in to help to provide them services, we would save that $5. So now I think there is a recognition that if we provide some resources for people who come back into the community, prevent them from recidivating or help them avoid recidivism, it's actually a wise use of taxpayer dollars. And the first real federal opportunity is called the Second Chance Act. And if you go to the hyperlink there, you will get a description of what that is. It was funded in 2008. It basically provides federal government support to state, tribal, or local governments and to nonprofits to receive funding to improve outcomes for those returning from institutions. And this program gives governments and nonprofits a lot of flexibility in what to fund. If you go to that website there, you'll see a lot of the programs that have been funded. There are mental health programs. There's co-occurring substance abuse mental health programs. There are education programs. There are job training programs. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. Now, not many tribes have been funded under this. And now, unfortunately, what happens a lot of times with these programs is tribes are put in a position of having to compete against much bigger jurisdictions. And it'd be difficult for a small tribe in Nevada to submit an application that is going to be funded when you're competing against cities like San Francisco, New York, or LA. But tribes, if they develop a program that has a unique cultural component, the Second Chance Act is a program that could possibly fund that program. Now, unfortunately, the Second Chance Act funding the deadline is already passed for this year, but it usually comes out in the spring, and I think the deadline is usually May. So if you're interested in looking at potential funding there, look for the solicitation when it comes out next spring. Okay, next, Travis. Now, there are also programs specifically devised to help violent offenders who come back into the community. It's called the Severe and Violent Offender Reentry Initiative. And then SAMSHA has programs focusing on mental health, substance abuse issues for people coming back. Now, the Severe and Violent Offender Reentry Initiative is actually a collaboration amongst 3 agencies: Department of Justice, Health and Human Services, and the Department of Labor. And it's specifically designed to deal with violent offenders. Now, like a lot of these programs don't provide for direct funding to Indian tribes, but tribes can work with a state or county to submit a collaborative application. SAMHSA does allow direct funding to Indian tribes, and a lot of Indian tribes have received SAMHSA grants to work with mental health issues facing their citizens or substance abuse issues. So those are a couple of programs also available. Next, Travis. And there's also some Department of Labor has some opportunities for those people returning to your community. Again, one of the problems is the difficulty it is in obtaining employment when you come back a convicted felon. One of the first questions I ask sometimes on a job application, are you a convicted felon? And I believe I gave you a statistic. Many employers won't even interview people who say yes there. And one of the things that you would note under the Tribal Law and Order Act, tribes now can actually exercise felony jurisdiction, and many of them have. So now we also have the problem where tribes may actually designate people felons. So this creates a situation where you need some funding, some resources to have jobs available for those people coming back to the community. In the next slide, Travis. And then don't forget it's a typo, it should be Coordinated Tribal Assistance Solicitation. The Department of Justice and other programs have one big solicitation for a variety of categories that Indian tribes can apply for. And there are numerous categories under CTAS that could fund reentry. There's a category, Community Planning for Tribal Justice Resources. That's a category 2. That's a program where you can get funding to develop a community plan, to develop a reentry plan. I mean, it requires a planning process you go through, but I think it allows you to step back and really assess what are the problems facing your community when it comes to people coming back. The Tribal Court Assistance in Indian Alcohol and Substance Abuse Prevention Program. That's category 3 of CTAS. That's been used by a lot of Indian tribes to develop healing to wellness courts or drug courts. It's also been used to develop probation programs or reentry programs. The Department of Justice gives tribes a lot of flexibility in these grants. So don't overlook category 3. Now, category 4 is a category of the CTAS solicitation that many tribes don't realize. That category 4 can be utilized to develop like transitional housing for people coming out of prison. Because category 4 is oftentimes looked upon as a corrections category. Many people think Category 4 is only for building prisons or rehabilitating jails in Indian communities, but the Department of Justice allows tribes to apply for funding for transitional housing, which again is a huge issue in tribal communities, where oftentimes 95% of the housing in that community is automatically shut off from people coming out of prison because of their felony status. So you can look at Category 4. There are other categories I haven't listed here. The OJJDP provides funding under the Tribal Youth Program. If you have a lot of young youth coming back to your community from institutions and you want to work with them, you could utilize that level of funding too. So there are creative ways you can use CTAS to fund reentry programs. Okay, next slide. And just to show you that this is being done in many communities, I went ahead and found several different tribal programs that have successfully implemented reentry programs. Some of these are based in the public defender program, like the Salish Kootenai Confederated Salish Kootenai Tribes Holistic Defense Program. That's a program where instead of just defending a person, the program also attempts to help that person deal with other issues in their life, housing, mental health issues. So it's a sort of reentry type program that's based in the public defender program. I've already mentioned the Citizen Wahpeton Parole Office. It's a joint program with the state of South Dakota and the tribe. So the tribe hires a parole officer funded by the state, and the tribe can work with tribal members. The Nisquallies have a services called the Native American Reentry Services. They have a variety of services available for their members coming back from prison. And I gave a few others there. There's actually, Standing Rock has a reentry program that the federal government and the tribe have entered into, where the tribe gets notified of people coming out of federal prison and the federal government pitches in some resources. So it's being done. It can be done. And again, it's critical that it be done because it's the last key link to restorative justice, closing that circle. If we don't allow people to redeem themselves for what they've done, we're denying that restorative justice. So I think it's critical that we close that last link, close that circle, allow people to re-enter in a dignified way and contribute again to the community. And lastly, if you need some, last slide, if you need some help, some technical assistance on developing a reentry program, APPA, which Travis is employed by and is sponsoring this webinar, has a grant from the Department of Justice to work with Indian tribes of reentry and Indian communities. So there are services out there in the form of technical assistance where you can contact APPA, and APPA can provide technical assistance to your community if you're looking to develop a reentry program. So again, it can be done. There are a lot of tribes that have successfully started reentry programs, that have successfully reintegrated people into their communities. It's critical that this get done. Again, statistically speaking, Native people, unfortunately, are more likely to be incarcerated. Therefore, they're more likely to have the need for these services to come back into the community. So I would encourage you to focus on this area. This is an important area for restorative justice. And I truly believe without giving people that chance of redemption and that chance of dignity in their lives, we're denying them something that most tribal communities looked at as extremely important, and that is giving to people the right to restore for the wrongs that they've done. So I appreciate that you're interested in these reentry programs. There are resources. And I think it's now time for questions, if anyone had any. Right, Travis?
Yes, sir, BJ. If anyone has any questions, just go on and feel free to type them into the chat or the questions panel, and I'll relay them to BJ and try and get you guys an answer. I had a question for myself, BJ. What do you
Yeah.
think? What's your biggest challenge in dealing with reentry and drugs? Is it funding or mental health? I know you touched on a lot of challenges. What's the hardest one you've had to deal with?
I think the most difficult one, I think, is young people who get sent to prison. Many of them do for the first time, and this is a sad commentary, for the first time learn about cultural ways, spiritual ways, and they get excited, energized, and then they come back to a community where sometimes people aren't practicing those traditional ways, and they get quite discouraged. And I think that's because we're not connecting them to people in the community that are practicing those positive lifestyles. Unfortunately, in the criminal justice system, we get jaded because we only see dysfunction, whereas there's so many healthy families in the tribal communities that we never see because they're not involved in our systems. So we have to, in some way, keep that energy, keep that spiritual energy going. And by doing that and helping young people stay attuned, stay in touch with their traditional ways, their ceremonies, their language, and people who are actually living that, to me, that's been the most successful way of people changing their lives spiritually, because the spiritual life is oftentimes the most neglected one when you're living a life of drug and alcohol addiction or crime. So finding that ability to keep young people energized when they come back to the community, I think, is a real key.
All right. Well, thank you, Your Honor. I don't have any other questions or anything in the chat, so I guess we'll call it a presentation there. I'd like to thank our presenter, the Honorable BJ Jones, and then everyone that took the time out of their day to participate and listen to what we had to say regarding some of these issues. And there'll be another one of these webinars next month. It's going to be on employment issues and reentry in Indian country. It's going to be presented by American Indian Development Associates. It was slated for August 23rd, but we may change the date on that to get some guest speakers in there. So just keep your eye out for registration information regarding that session. And like I said earlier, this will be on YouTube if you guys want to watch it again or send it out to somebody. So I appreciate your time today and hope everyone has a good weekend. And once again, thanks, BJ.
Thank you now. Have a good day.
All right, bye-bye.